Most people today are familiar with the story of the Titanic, but just in case, let's go over the basics. The Titanic was built in Belfast, Ireland, starting in 1909. 3 years later, the ship was finished and ready for its maiden voyage, or in other words, first trip across the ocean. Most passengers set sail from Southampton, England. Then it picked up a few more passengers in France, and then Ireland. Then finally, we set sail across the ocean to New York. But of course, the Titanic never makes it. 4 days into her journey, she hits an iceberg in the middle of the ocean. It only takes about 2.5 hours for the ship to sink. There were only enough lifeboats for about half of the people. However, these lifeboats were not filled all the way. Sadly, only about 700 people survived. Now here we are, more than 100 years later, and this is still the most famous ship in history. The Titanic was referred to as an Olympic-class liner. There were 3 of them, sometimes referred to as sister ships. The Titanic sunk because of an iceberg, and then the Britannic sunk after hitting a mine in World War I. The Olympic, however, had a fairly successful career of about 24 years. All 3 sister ships were almost identical, just a few details were changed on the inside. When they finished building the Titanic, it was the largest ship in the world, being only a little bit heavier than the Olympic. The ship was 269 meters long. But to put this in perspective, here's a comparison to the world's largest cruise ship today. The full name is the RMS Titanic, and RMS stands for Royal Mail Ship. And in fact, yes, the Titanic did indeed carry plenty of mail on board. I'll show you where a little bit later. Let's look at some of the details on the outside of the ship. The front of the ship is called the bow. The back of the ship is called the stern. Then instead of using left and right, they use port and starboard. Now these are general sailing terms that are still in use today, not just for the Titanic. On the ship, we have 4 funnels. Coal is burned down below and the smoke comes up the funnels. Only 3 of the funnels are used. The 4th one was added mainly for looks. The builders thought it might appear more powerful with the 4th one. However, this 4th funnel is still helpful for ventilation down below. These 2 large poles are what they call the mast. It was used as supports for the radio antennas and also to carry the flags. Towards the front of the ship, you can see the crow's nest. This is where the lookout spotted the iceberg only a little bit too late. The area in the front is called the forecastle deck. You can see the massive chains that attach to the anchors at the very front. Going to the back of the ship, this area is called the poop deck. And no, this has nothing to do with bodily functions. It originated from the Latin word puppus, which literally means stern of the ship. So there you go, poop deck. I'm still getting used to the name, but that's what they call it. This raised part is called the docking bridge. It was used by the crew to help guide the ship into the harbor. The Titanic also had several electric cargo cranes to help with loading and unloading at the docks. There's also more cranes at the front of the ship. The Titanic had 3 massive propellers underneath the water. For comparison, here's the size of a person. The propellers are powered by the ship's massive engines. We'll learn about how these work later in the video. This is the rudder used to steer the ship. The ship was designed and built over 100 years ago. That means no computers, no 3D design software. This was all designed by hand. To me, that's incredible engineering and craftsmanship. The Titanic had 10 decks inside. The very top deck is called the boat deck. Then below, they label the decks with the letters A through G. But each of these decks also had another name, so you could call it A deck or promenade deck, B deck or bridge deck, and so on. Then for the bottom 2, we have the orlop deck and the tank top. This area has a lot of the ship's engines and machinery. Passengers are not allowed down here. Let's see this from another point of view. Let's cut the ship right down the middle and see what this looks like. A few things to point out. The first 3 funnels, you can see how they are connected down below to the boilers. They take the smoke and give it a place to go. Then, just like we talked about earlier, that fourth funnel isn't really needed. However, it still provided some ventilation to the decks below. The first class passengers had two sets of stairs, the forward grand staircase and the aft grand staircase. The forward grand staircase went all the way down to E deck. Directly in front of it is the three elevators. Then we have the aft grand staircase over here, which doesn't go down quite as far, only down to C deck. Then here we have the staircases for the second class passengers. And then the staircase for the third class passengers in the very back of the ship. This was all close to the steering machinery. This is why third class was sometimes referred to as steerage passengers. So cabins for the third class passengers are here towards the lower decks, and here's where the second class passengers are, and the first class passengers got to stay on the highest decks and have some of the best views. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the layout of the ship. Now let's go through each deck, starting with the boat deck. And then the first class smoke room. This is where the men would gather after dinner time. The last is the veranda cafe and palm court, which served refreshments for the first class passengers. This is B deck, also known